The situation on the front in Ukraine indicates that the Russian Federation is preparing for a new large-scale offensive in several directions at once. Thus, the Kremlin is betting on a military solution to end the war rather than on peaceful negotiations. This is stated in a new report by the Washington Institute for the Study of War. Analysts noted that in the summer, the Russian Federation intends to launch large-scale offensive operations in southern Ukraine and in the Donbass. In addition, analysts emphasize that the Kremlin is trying to undermine security guarantees for Ukraine from the United States and Western allies. They also talk about how exactly the shutdown of Starlink terminals affected the combat capabilities of the Russians and whether the armed forces of Ukraine took advantage of this situation. We'll cover all this in this episode. My name is Pechiy. Let's discuss this topic, but first please subscribe to the channel, like the video, comment, and join my Telegram channel Pechiy News. The link is in this video's description. So, let's start with the question of security guarantees. As the Institute for the Study of War writes, the Kremlin continues to reject any meaningful security guarantees that could protect Ukraine from complete diplomatic or military capitulation. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov confirmed on February 6 that the Kremlin rejects the security guarantees for Ukraine provided by the West. He once again stated the Kremlin's support for the so-called security guarantees that Russia agreed upon during the negotiations in Istanbul in April 2022. Let me remind you that the draft Istanbul Protocol of 2022 did not lay the foundation for meaningful security guarantees and would have left Ukraine defenseless in the face of renewed Russian aggression. The draft Istanbul Protocol stipulated that Russia, that is the aggressor in this war, would be considered a neutral guarantor state for Ukraine. That Russia and China would have the right to veto the response mechanism to future aggression in Ukraine, and that Ukraine commits to total neutrality, strict limitations on the size and composition of its armed forces, and undertakes never to accept military assistance from its allies. Lavrov's statement from February 6 is the latest in a series of statements by high-ranking Kremlin officials indicating that the Kremlin continues to view the 2024 Istanbul Draft Agreement as the basis for any future peace settlement, and it is not rigid and is willing to compromise on its demands both to Ukraine and to NATO. Both dictator Putin and other Kremlin officials have repeatedly rejected the United States proposal regarding a peace plan and security guarantees. And importantly, they have rejected any requests for compromise on any of their original military objectives. And so, based on this and understanding that Ukraine will not agree to such conditions, it is reported that Russia, the Russian military command, plans to use its likely limited strategic reserves for an offensive planned for the summer of 2026 in the south and east of Ukraine. However, according to analysts, the Russian military lacks the reserves needed for adequate preparation for such an offensive and for achieving its goals. Ukrainian military observer Konstantin Mashovets assessed on February 5 that Russian troops had started preparing for the expected summer 2026 offensive, which Mashovets predicts could begin as early as late April 2026. Mashovets suggested that Russian troops will likely focus on the Sloviansk, Kramatorsk, and Orekiv-Zaporizhia directions. Mashovets noted that Russian troops are experiencing difficulties in capturing the necessary initial positions to begin the summer offensive in the coming months. Since, according to Mashovets, Russian troops are stuck in achieving tactical objectives in these directions and are not advancing quickly enough to meet the deadlines set by the Russian military command. Mashovets assessed that the Russian military command does not want to use its strategic reserves, which, according to Mashovets, the Russian command has been trying to accumulate since the fall of 2025, to speed up these preparatory tactical actions, since this will reduce the expenditure of reserves needed for the upcoming summer campaign. In general, for now, the plans are very ambitious but unrealistic. Now let me quote the Institute for the Study of War. The Institute observes reports that Russia is forming a strategic reserve from conscripts starting in July 2025, potentially to facilitate such an offensive. But it is having difficulties replenishing its losses in Ukraine and is forced to deploy operational reserves to support current combat operations. The Russian military command will likely have to choose between deploying its limited strategic reserves now to better prepare for the summer offensive, or risking the use of the strategic reserve later in the summer, but from less advantageous positions. Analysts also write that Russian forces are setting the conditions for future offensive operations in the directions of Slavyansk, Kramatorsk and Orekov-Zaporozhye, but so far they have not managed to achieve significant success in these areas. Russian forces are attacking towards Slavyansk and Gulyai-Pol, northeast of Orekov. In particular, they are targeting Ukrainian ground lines of communication that supply the forward positions, aiming to create an effect of interception on the battlefield and weaken the Ukrainian defense. But so far, the Russians have not been able to use these preparations to achieve significant operational successes. Nevertheless, according to analysts, Russian forces advanced relatively faster toward Gulyai-Pol back in November 2025 after a prolonged campaign of airstrikes on the battlefield. Since then, they haven't had major operational successes, though reports claim the Russians may have taken Gulyai-Pol. Russian forces likely intended to bypass Ukrainian defenses south of Orekhiv from the direction of Gulyai-Pol and join Russian efforts toward Orekhiv to advance towards Zaporizhzhia, but in the end, they were unable to cut off the Ukrainian armed forces supply line. Despite this, the Institute for the Study of War writes, quote, Russian plans for a summer offensive highlight Russia's determination to achieve its military objectives, including the capture of Donetsk and Zaporizhzhia regions by military means if necessary. High-ranking Kremlin officials have repeatedly stated that they will continue their efforts on the battlefield to achieve their goals if they cannot achieve them through negotiations. The Russian military command's intention to launch a large-scale summer offensive, even if Russian forces find it difficult to achieve their objectives, demonstrates the Kremlin's complete lack of interest in seeking a solution to end the war through negotiations in the coming weeks or months. And one more important point about the blocking of Starlink terminals. Analysts from the Institute for the Study of War assert that SPACEX's blocking of unregistered Starlink terminals on Ukrainian territory is indeed hindering Russian ground operations and tactical strikes. Sources in the General Staff of Ukraine reported that SPACEX's attempts to block unregistered Starlink satellite communication terminals forced Russian troops to reduce the number of assaults on the front line and temporarily halted all of them. The spokesperson for a Ukrainian brigade operating in the Zaporizhzhia direction reported that Russian troops have reduced the number of assault operations and operations involving drones. Russian military correspondents have generally expressed concern about the blocking of the terminals, claiming that the lack of access to Starlink is hindering Russian military operations and that Russian troops are trying to create an equivalent system. Moreover, some consider those who are not in Ukraine to be traitors. So that they would, for a certain amount of money, go and register Starlink terminals at Synapse and pass them off as Ukrainian. Russians on the front line will use them. So this problem still needs to be solved as well, because unfortunately there may be people like that. It's important that the Russians admitted blocking Starlink would impact their operations, such as near Konstantinovka. But the key message from the Institute for the Study of War is that the Russians are clearly preparing for a new offensive after all. For some reason, Washington still believes that Putin really wants peace and is ready to engage in proper negotiations. I'll leave it at that. Share your opinions and conclusions in the comments below this episode, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and don't forget to like. If you found this episode useful or interesting, you can support our work with your donation or a paid subscription using the links and details in the description of this video. I appreciate your support. That's all for now. Take care and goodbye, everyone.